Hello, this is the Business Briefing. I'm Susannah Streeter. Trouble in the pipeline. Crude prices slump further as virus fears grow. Can oil producers do anything to stop the slide? Plus, the fight for 50-50. Will India's women ever get equal access to the boardroom? And on the financial markets, the sell-off resumes as US shares tumble yet again. The Dow down 3.5% as the coronavirus fears spread and Asia follows. Now we start with the coronavirus outbreak. Its impact is being felt right across the business world. And this Friday, the nations that produce much of the world's oil are trying to limit the damage to their economies. Members of the oil producers group OPEC and their partners, including Russia, are trying to reach a deal to cut production and prop up the price of crude. Well, here's why. Look at the price of Brent crude oil. At the beginning of the year, when the first reports of the coronavirus began to emerge, it was over $68 a barrel. It slumped to around $48, a drop of almost a third. The International Energy Agency thinks global demand for oil has actually been falling in the first 3 months of this year. Now, that's not happened since the global financial crisis more than a decade ago. OPEC has now slashed its estimates for growth this year by half, or 480 million barrels. Now, they've come up with a plan for a big cut in production, but producing less oil also means a financial hit for oil nations, and they have to persuade Russia and other non-OPEC members to agree. On Thursday, one of OPEC's top officials appealed for the nations to work together.
Today's meeting comes as COVID-19 is clearly negatively impacting the demand of oil in 2020, especially in the first and second quarters. This shows that the fluctuation of the oil market is subject to uncertainties that are too much for any one part to face alone. Therefore, complex challenges require concerted efforts and dialogue. In this regard, our allies are in constant contact with our partners and friends in the Republic of China.
Well, Joseph Getula is head of oil and gas analysis at Fitch Solutions. Hello there, Joseph. Thanks very much for coming in. So another emergency meeting there, trying to work out what we should be doing as far as the price of oil is concerned. And there's going to be this key meeting of OPEC today. What do you expect from this meeting? Do you think there will be agreement?
I think at this point where oil prices are, we're going to see agreement. Really, what's happening now is the main OPEC body has agreed to about a 1.5 million barrel cut. Now it's getting the OPEC plus members, more specifically Russia, to agree with this cut. Where prices are, where the impacts of coronavirus have impacted demand already in Q1, especially in China, we see it unlikely that Russia would not back this cut, being, there's significant downside pressure on prices.
There have, though, already been some noises coming out of Russia questioning really how long this should last. Do you think it could be a kind of phased approach, that we might see a cut until the summer and then perhaps a review following that?
Yeah, I think that's the prudent move. When OPEC Plus had cut earlier in the year for Q1, they had limited the expectations to just Q1. We're probably going to see that again to the end of Q2, the June timeframe. Really what that is about is at some point these barrels are going to have to come back to the market. Collectively, OPEC is holding about 6 million barrels off of the market, which at some point, is going to come back. Setting market expectation on that timing is really going to help them do that in the least painful way in terms of pricing. So that makes sense.
And what impact will this have on shale oil production?
Well, we've already seen reports just yesterday from Exxon that they've decreased their expectation from growth from U.S. shale by about 10%. While it's not material in terms of the massive numbers that OPEC are producing, it's kind of the first sign that we're seeing some slowing in plans for U.S. shale growth, which is a big deal.
OK, Joseph Getula, thank you very much for talking us through all of those developments as far as the impact on oil is concerned. Thank you. So let's stay with the economic impact of the coronavirus, because the sell-off on global stock markets really has resumed, with more steep losses on Wall Street. Early optimism about government stimulus measures to cushion the blow has evaporated, as Michelle Fleury now reports from New York.
While healthcare systems grapple with how to cope with the virus, financial markets are doing the same. Once again, US stocks were pummeled, and after 2 days in which it made record points gains, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell more than 3%. 29 of the 30 stocks that make up the index finished in the red. The yield also on the 10-year US debt fell to a record low, not exactly a vote of confidence in the growth prospects of the world's largest economy. Now, earlier this week, Cleveland Federal Reserve President Loretta Mester told the BBC this is going to be a more or less temporary shock to the economy. But how temporary? And that is the problem for company bosses and for investors. Nobody knows how bad things could get. As one investor put it, there is no way to model this. Will it be worst-case scenario like China, where mass quarantines meant economic activity essentially came to a standstill, or will it be something milder? Given all of these unknowns, it's hard to gauge what is the right medicine for the world economy. Here in the United States, the policy response so far has been an emergency interest rate cut. And Congress is working on an $8.3 billion aid package. But again, if you don't know whether the problem is demand, in other words, people not buying things, or supply as a result of business disruptions, then how can you administer the right solution? All of this means expect a lot more volatility ahead in the markets.
Michelle Fleury there with the latest on Wall Street. Well, let's see how things are going in Asia. Mariko Oy is watching developments for us. Mariko, certainly as far as share prices are concerned, there's been another rout, hasn't there?
Indeed, Susannah, I have to say it's been a brutal couple of weeks for investors around the world, especially here in Asia as well. As you said, every major market in Asia are in the red, including Japan's Nikkei, which opened about 1.5% lower, but now down by more than 3%. Also, Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index down by almost 2%. Of course, Japan's Nikkei has been hurt by the fact that the Japanese yen has been strengthening, especially against the US dollar. It's now at the strongest level in almost 6 months. And of course, that hurts Japanese exporters because it makes them less competitive abroad, and that's been hitting exporters' shares. But in particular, airline shares have been hit the hardest because, as we've been reporting, a lot of passengers have been cancelling their flights. In fact, airlines have been cancelling their flights as well. So we're definitely seeing that impact today.
OK, Mariko, thank you very much for that update. So a real push upwards for the yen, seen as a bit of a safe haven. OK, let's move on to some other news now. On Sunday, people around the world will celebrate the annual International Women's Day. And the theme for this year is Each for Equal. Organisers are calling on every individual, men and women, to challenge stereotypes and to celebrate the achievements of women. In India, laws have helped make some progress towards putting more women in boardrooms, but there's a long way to go, as Nikhil Amanda reports from Mumbai.
Valli Arunachalam has been fighting a pitched battle for the past 6 months for a seat on the board of her company. One of the heirs to the Murugappa Group, a $5 billion conglomerate which sells everything from insurance to fertilizers and auto parts, she says her uncles and cousins are denying her a seat at the table only because she's a woman.
While every branch of the Murugappa family tree has at least one representative on the board, our family branch has no representation. This is the only branch that has female heirs and no male heir. So this is clearly gender bias.
The Murugappa Group has declined to comment on the matter. But Arunachalam's fight is possibly the most high-profile example of the deep-seated gender bias prevalent in parts of corporate India, where women in senior management positions are few and far between. The climb up the corporate ladder is a struggle for women not just here in India but across the world. Goldman Sachs recently announced that it will not do IPOs for companies that have all-white, all-male boards. In fact, here in India as well, regulation mandates that companies of a certain size have at least one woman on the board, and that is bringing about some improvements. In 2012, around 5% of board members at select listed companies were women. That figure has risen to 15% in 2019. Industrial giant the Godrej Group has been one of India's largest producers of soaps, shampoos and hair dyes over the past century. Its consumer division has 5 women on a 14-member board.
We tested them, none of
Its
them.
chairperson says it's as much a business imperative as a moral one.
Our consumers, the deciders, even if they're men and children using the products, it's normally the woman who's deciding and shopping and buying. So, how can you not have that representation of what real life is? I mean, real life is 50-50.
And that's Godrej's immediate goal, 50-50 or a board that's gender equal. Nikhil Anandar, BBC News, Mumbai.
Now, up next, News Briefing will take you through the stories making the headlines in the global news media today.
Across the globe, people have come to rely on an array of products, from bicycles to whiskey, spices to semiconductors.
The phone has made my job very easy.
This series looks at the people, systems and networks that go into making and bringing them to market.
We're spreading the knowledge and the technology across the globe.
Made on Earth on BBC World News.
Join me, Tom Brooke, for the very best from the world of film. From the latest big-budget Hollywood blockbuster to acclaimed international art house film.
잠깐. 제시카 외동딸 일리노이 시카고.
Coverage of all the major film festivals and influential filmmakers. And intelligent, in-depth analysis of the latest films and cinema trends.
역시.
That's Talking Movies with me, Tom Brooke, on BBC World News.
In the world of business, everything is connected. From global hubs to places less traveled. The big stories to your bottom line. The path can be unpredictable. But with the right insights, you can see where the bend in the road will lead. Business on BBC News. Make the connection.
The generation after apartheid ended are free to love whoever they want. But why are Black and Asian origin couples still facing challenges? Our World, Blasian Love in South Africa on BBC World News.
This is the briefing from BBC News. The latest headlines. Israel and Palestinian authorities have declared a state of emergency and placed Bethlehem under quarantine because there are 7 cases of coronavirus in the city. Governments around the world are racing to contain the virus, but concerns about the increase in cases have sent international markets falling. The US Vice President, Mike Pence, has promised to help authorities keep track of the virus. In a speech intended to reassure Americans, the government is doing everything possible to stop it spreading. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, hundreds of holidaymakers are stranded on a cruise ship and are being prevented from docking. A ceasefire agreed between the Russian and Turkish presidents has come into effect in the Syrian province of Idlib. New measures include joint patrols and a safety corridor. Escalating fighting in recent weeks has raised fears of a direct confrontation between Russia and Turkey. Now it's time to look at the stories that are making the headlines in the media right across the world. And we begin with The Telegraph, who says a new advice for patients with a mild case of coronavirus is for them to stay at home rather than seek treatment in hospital amid rising pressure on the NHS. Meanwhile, the Japan Times reports some 290 million students worldwide are facing weeks at home as Italy becomes the latest country to shut schools due to the deadly new coronavirus. The paper also says the IMF is urging an all-out global offensive against the epidemic. In the Times business section, fears about the COVID-19 outbreak have sent world stock markets deep into the red as the virus spreads in the US and the UK. The airline industry is warning it's facing a huge financial hit, with more and more businesses having to send staff home. On the Guardian website, the UK government could build a tunnel under the Irish Sea instead of a bridge linking Scotland with Northern Ireland. That's according to Scottish Secretary Alistair Jack, who said he had raised the tunnel proposal with Boris Johnson as a cheaper and more weatherproof option than a bridge over the sea. And finally, in The Independent, Twitter has revealed a new version of tweets named Fleets, which disappear after they're posted. The temporary messages are also intended to be more private, since they can't be engaged with in public and direct messages. It comes as users complain that tweets are too public and too permanent. OK, well, joining me now is Lawrence Gosling, who's Editor-in-Chief of What Investment. Hello there, Lawrence.
Good to see you.
You've been taking a big look through all of these stories. Let's start off with the lead story in the Daily Telegraph. Patients being told to stay at home if they get a mild virus. There is increasing worries about the impact on the NHS of this outbreak.
Absolutely, and I think, you know, kind of concerns been raised in the UK because obviously it had the first fatality of somebody within the country sort of yesterday. And of course we've got the Daily Telegraph is quoting the sort of NHS's sort of medical director with this advice, which actually I don't think is probably too far from what the original advice was a couple of weeks ago, when it wasn't so much of a concern in the UK, which is essentially ring the helpline, the NHS helpline, where you talk about your symptoms, and then somebody there says, actually, it sounds like it's not that serious, so stay at home. And of course, clearly, if we see the sort of level of cases that perhaps have been seen in other countries, such as Italy, the stretch on the NHS might be quite severe.
The problem is, though, of course, many people, particularly the older generation, who feel that they really are at most risk. They, of course, want to take those precautions as soon as possible.
Absolutely, and we're sort of told, you know, senior citizens, people with underlying health conditions are the ones potentially at the sort of highest risk. So if you are an older member of the sort of country, you're going to naturally kind of worry about this, particularly because this is entirely new. It's you know, it's a virus that we don't really know anything about at the moment, and I think it's that kind of level of concern that is beginning to kind of sort of spread more deeply into countries.
Absolutely. You talk about that and the measures as well that some countries are employing. Schools halted for 290 million worldwide. That's in the Japan Times.
Absolutely.
Introduced these very, very stringent measures. It's a real headache for working parents in particular.
Absolutely. And, you know, in Japan in particular, Prime Minister Abe is being sort of criticised for sort of closing schools and saying they won't reopen until the end of March or even sort of early April. And, you know, he's quite rightly sort of said, well, look, it's better to essentially to be safe than sort of sorry. But, of course, you've got the implications where, you know, if you've got kind of working parents, they can't leave children at home on their own if they're a certain age. Some of the Japanese schools are actually allowing parents to drop children into after-school clubs that are still open in some schools. Although clearly there isn't enough places, you know. So you've got this kind of massive kind of practical kind of issue. As societies, we can't all stay at home because, you know, we might be passing on the virus if we had it in the first place to our own loved ones.
Boom time for those teachers who are able to work remotely, and all of those kind of online education courses using Skype. I mean, we've got Zoom communications, for example. Share price really zoomed right up, hasn't it?
Yeah.
This kind of video conferencing software.
Yeah, and I've seen cases. There's a case in Italy of some private schools that are running lessons by using sort of one of the Microsoft sort of programs for its sort of students, and interestingly enough, attendance at the lessons has gone up.
Now, with so many people being told to stay at home, with limits on travel, inevitably this has had a major impact on business sectors right around the world. And really, the stock markets are back into the red right across the world. That's the headline in the Times Business. And we're seeing, you know, a situation, for example, the interest rate cut, the US Federal Reserve, an emergency cut, not since the financial crisis.
No.
But that hasn't quelled markets.
It's made absolutely no difference at all. And I thought it was kind of quite fascinating that they decided to cut so early in this, because at the point that they sort of cut, you know, the virus had only just begun to sort of kind of reach kind of US states. Now, obviously, more deaths down the line. And I suspect we're going to see probably another couple of weeks of kind of quite extreme volatility on sort of stock markets. So, unfortunately for savers and investors, there'd probably be a lot more red on those screens.
And certainly we have had those growth projections from the International Monetary Fund. They're certainly not going to reassure investors anytime soon, are they? Because there's a huge cut in growth forecast.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the leading investment banks are talking about 0.5 to 1% being sort of knocked off global growth. And in economies like the UK, where growth is quite low, I wouldn't be surprised if we technically see a recession in 1 or 2 countries, which is two quarters of negative growth sometime in the next sort of 3 or 4 months.
OK, let's move away from the coverage of the coronavirus for the moment and look at this story in The Guardian, because apparently the Scottish Secretary has advised Boris Johnson to build an Irish Sea tunnel and not a bridge. Now, this is really interesting. It's an idea from Boris Johnson initially to build this bridge from the UK mainland over the Irish Sea, but apparently there's some discussion about whether that is feasible at all.
Yeah, Alistair Jack, who's the minister in concern, has said that the Prime Minister was using a bridge as a euphemism, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But anybody who knows anything about the sort of the weather patterns in the north of Ireland or across to Scotland will know that you know, it's quite windy, to put it sort of simply. So the idea of having a large bridge, it would be 22 miles between the two countries, kind of rattling the way in the wind of the sort of the severe weather we've seen in the last couple of months, realises it's probably impractical. So actually a tunnel, which according to Alistair Jack is cheaper to build and actually sounds a lot sort of safer. So there's a more realistic suggestion to something. Whether we actually see it in the current sort of Parliament, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, you look at the cost of the Channel Tunnel and just how long that took.
Yes, exactly. The UK doesn't have a great record on building these kind of infrastructure type projects, even though it's only 22 miles long. And we don't know how long it would take to build.
In the meantime, we still don't know what kind of bridge there will be. As far as the economic ties are concerned, in the future, we're so much still undetermined as far as Brexit is concerned.
Exactly. Well, if this gets a sort of go-ahead, we'll end up talking about where that red line in the sea between the two sort of countries is from a sort of, you know, an export perspective. So it'd be kind of interesting if they build it and there's a little red line down the middle of this sort of tunnel, or across the bridge, clearly, that sort of says you've gone from one country to another. But this feels like the kind of project that actually, over the longer term, will come to fruition. Because,
in fact, there has been a big focus on infrastructure. HS2 here in the UK, greenlit, and there is a kind of real willingness to greenlight many other major infrastructure projects. But of course, there are probably quite a few others that are higher up the list than this tunnel.
I'm going to say the economies of the north of Ireland and Scotland are, you know, two of the areas within the United Kingdom that really kind of probably do need long-term sustained sort of government support to kind of develop and expand their economy. So again, this is why something like this feels like a sort of practical and realistic suggestion, and one that could, if it was achieved, probably have a long-term benefit.
OK, well, let's move on now to another story that we've actually asked for your views about here on the programme today. This is a change at Twitter to introduce so-called fleets to share fleeting thoughts.
Yes.
Is this Twitter playing catch-up with the likes of Instagram and Snapchat?
Well, it definitely says that, and when they released the news, they actually did it via a tweet, not surprisingly enough, and said in its sort of tweet to its kind of users, this probably feels a bit like stories, and then try to explain why it's not. But it is. I mean, and there's a kind of, you know, the more sort of serious point where, you know, in the last sort of few years, we've seen everybody kind of going back. Somebody comes into the public eye and finding something that he or she sort of said that in a different context doesn't feel quite sort of acceptable. In some cases, was never acceptable in the first place. We see a lot of Premiership footballers, for example, who've been found out to say kind of inappropriate things when they were 15 or 16 years old, for example. And obviously a number of sort of celebrities again. So you can see where the practical aspect of this sort of comes.
Some people say, actually, can't we just edit our tweets? That would make it easier.
Well,
but there's been resistance.
Yeah, I was going to say, at the end of the day, don't say anything inappropriate in the first place, and then it won't matter whether it's there for 24 hours or forever. I mean, you know, a lot of people shouldn't say these things in the first place.
Absolutely. OK, Lawrence Gosling, thank you very much for talking us through all of the stories from around the world. There is, of course, still so much more to come here on BBC News. We will be covering all the latest on the coronavirus outbreak and spread.
There is little sign of life in this charred bushland. Normally, it would be teeming with animals.
The men who control the political parties and the militias won't give up power easily.
Thousands of Angelinos have made their way here to the home of the LA Lakers and the place where Kobe Bryant played throughout the whole of his 20-year career. This is the main clinic for pregnant women, women who've recently had babies, and for young children.
Beijing's authoritarian